Our first vintages at Fonseca were launched in the 1840s, and still today, Fonseca is known as the vintage port house. It's the house that has the greatest number of 100-point vintage ports. My name is David Guimaraens, and my family started Fonseca 6 generations ago, and I'm proud to have been the winemaker now back home for 33 years. Well, welcome to the Fonseca Visitor Centre. We are in Vila Nova de Gaia, and Vila Nova de Gaia is where you come to get the history of the port trade, very much from the perspective of the port shipper, the port merchants. And where that is very important to put into context is when you think about the world of wine, most wine regions around the world, the vineyards and the wineries are in the same location. And we are here in Vila Nova de Gaia, which is in fact on the coast, very separate geographically to the demarcated wine region of the Douro, where the vineyards are and where the young ports are made. That's very much a historical perspective, and when we look at our history that goes back over 3 centuries, the port trade is all about merchants like my family, my ancestors, who started trading in port, and we established ourselves here in Vila Nova de Gaia with our port lodges, like we are in here today. And my ancestors, as good merchants they were, they would go to the valley and they built ongoing relationships with local farmers. Port used to be brought down from the Douro Valley in the barrels in these flat-bottomed boats who would have to navigate through the rapids until they reached here, Vila Nova de Gaia, where the aging, the blending occurred, and then it's exactly those merchants who did the other very important part of the trade, which is taking port to the 4 corners of the world to be served in the many different styles that port has. In the old days, most port would go to the market in barrel. And in fact, up until 1970, the vintage port used to be bottled at the merchants in the different countries, in the UK, Holland, Denmark, 3 of our important traditional markets for vintage port. When we think about the winemaking of port, we look at the traditional method of foot treading, where you take the grapes, which they'll be picked into these open granite fermenters, and then in the evening, for a fermentation batch of 8 tons, we will put 20 people in there doing a very regimented treading. Then the next day, when most of the people who were treading the evening before will actually go into the vineyard to pick another batch of grapes, we'll keep a group of 5 or 6 people behind treading during the day. And that method, although it's very primitive, it is very effective. Because in port, because port is a fortified wine, where we stop the fermentation halfway through by adding a neutral grape spirit, we have a very short time in which to extract all of the color and all of the tannin from the skins. So that's why this traditional method of foot treading is very effective. And still today, we continue to use that method for producing all of our vintage ports. And what makes vintage port so special? What is vintage port? Vintage port is all about selecting the best ports that we make in one harvest, and then these ports will sit in wood for 2 years until they're bottled. Then the vintage will go into the bottle and it will continue its aging process in the bottle. So as the tawny ports aged in oak in contact with oxygen and get those nutty styles, the vintage port, because it is bottled only 2 years after the harvest, very young, and then will continue aging in a reduced atmosphere in the absence of oxygen, what will happen is as it ages, it throws its color and it develops all these wonderfully rich, spicy, bottle maturity aromas. And that is why the vintage port, I consider, is one of the greatest wines of the wine lover, because every bottle of vintage is a time capsule. It will capture the character of the year, or and the vineyards where it comes from. That's where you get the house style. Fonseca vintage will be made up from Fonseca's 3 vineyards, 3 properties, and together it produces this extraordinary vintage port, which is renowned for its intensity of fruit, its richness, its fatness, and its capacity to age for decades in the bottle. And that will characterize a Fonseca vintage. An important aspect with vintage port is that as it ages in the bottle, it will start throwing a sediment. And that sediment will increase over time. And that's why it is very important that if you're going to be serving a vintage port which is older than 4 years of age, then you need to decant it. And that decanting is important so that you remove the sediment and so that what you serve is not cloudy. Because if you pour a bottle and lift it between each glass, you will end up mixing up your sediment. So that is a very important part of vintage port. One of the other virtues of vintage port is exactly its ability to age in the bottle. For one, it is the safest bottle in your wine cellar, because if you forget about it, it's only going to get better. It's not something you can say about all of your wines in your wine cellar. But this extraordinary ability to age for a lifetime in the bottle gives it the pleasures for any wine lover to be able to, if he discovers a vintage port that he likes, he can buy more than one bottle and then lay him down in his wine cellar and open a bottle when he feels like it and accompany it as it ages. That's one way of looking at vintage port. Another way of looking at vintage is that it's also an extraordinary gift to give to someone who you care for tremendously, and you want that person to remember you, maybe even many years after we might not be here. For example, you have a godson, and instead of giving him a silver picture frame, which will get lost somewhere, if you give him a case of vintage and you dedicate it to him, when he grows up, when he gets to the age that he discovers fine wine, fine vintage port, guarantee when he opens one of those bottles, he will remember you. And you can do that for a godson, you can do it for your children, you can give it to somebody who you like dearly. So vintage port, not only being one of the great wines of the world, which has the greatest expression of location of year, it is also one of the best wines in the world to lay down, to put in your cellars, to drink whenever you feel of an occasion to enjoy a good bottle of wine. Well, Fonseca Bin 27 couldn't be closer to my heart. It is the port that my father launched in 1972. And my first real memory of Bin 27 is when I was sitting at around the dining table with my father, and my father was making up the first mock-up bottle of Fonseca Bin 27, which was what was the way he wanted to be taken to market. And this was the original Bin 27 bottle. So you take a normal bottle and you stencil the name Fonseca Bin 27 Port. And so I actually helped him paint that first bottle because although I was young at the time, I'm not sure my father was a great artist, but I remember that well. And that became the reference Fonseca Bin 27 package, which got launched in 1972. But it's very special for many other reasons. And one of them is that at the time, what we wanted to do is we wanted to take to the market a port which had the characteristics of a young vintage port. So what is a young vintage port? It's a port with a lot of fruit, young berry, rich blackcurrant fruit, a lot of structure, the perfect combination with chocolate or with cheese, but for everyday drinking. And that's what we have done in Fonseca Bin 27, and the reason why it's the #1 selling port in the United States, because people enjoy it as such. So here we look at my family history from Manuel Pedro Guimaraens, who was my ancestor, who, in fact, very much Portuguese, who started working with João dos Santos Fonseca back in the early 19th century. And it was, in fact, him who went to the UK and develop the House of Fonseca. João Santos Fonseca, in fact, left the business in his generation, and so my family, the Guimaraens family, continued for the destinations of Fonseca exclusively from the 1840s forward. I myself am called David Fonseca Guimaraens because Manuel Pedro, and such was his relationship with João Santos Fonseca that the Fonseca name got introduced to his children and subsequently from there forward. Inevitably, Guimaraens is not an easy name to pronounce, and Fonseca is a wonderful name and has continued as our house name.